change for you. I mean, you started under Clinton at the Cuba intersection. Under George W. Bush, the embargo is strong as ever. And now you're calling for a loosening of the restrictions.
Well, I learned a lot while I was in Cuba. First of all, I was sent there by Clinton, and Clinton had begun the new measures, which allowed considerably greater travel, expanded travel to Cuba. And what I learned from that is that made a real change within Cuba. With so many Americans traveling to Cuba and with more money coming into the ground, to the grassroots, to Cuban individuals, there was a lot more fluidity and a lot more openness in Cuban society. Furthermore, the Cuban hierarchy wasn't clamping down on civil society and human rights activists in the same way it had in the past, because they appreciated the visits of very important people. For example, the famous Project Varela, in which Osvaldo Paya was able to gain 11,000 signatures asking for a referendum on the Cuban Constitution and present it to the National Assembly. I don't think that could have ever happened had it not been that former President Jimmy Carter was coming to Cuba. And Fidel Castro wanted that visit, the Cuban hierarchy wanted that visit, and they knew very well they couldn't put down that kind of effort in Cuba. They couldn't throw these people in jail. They had to allow it to go forward. So having a more open relationship, just as in the case of Eastern Europe and the Helsinki agreements on human contact, make a huge difference. And that certainly convinced me, and I think it's convinced the Cuban Americans as well, because now a majority of Cuban Americans are opposed to the embargo, and significant majorities of Cuban Americans want Cuban American travel and even the travel of all Americans.
But yet in Congress, there seems to be continuing reluctance to move in any way toward normalization of relations. Could you give us your sense of why, as Arturo OFarrill says, we trade with China, we trade with Vietnam, we trade with so many other countries where our systems may be opposed to each other, yet with Cuba it remains this continuing more than 40-year embargo?
Well, there's no doubt that this has been a very unsuccessful policy, and so you would think we would change it. But I think there are two reasons, and they're both valid reasons. The first is domestic politics. Clearly, the South Florida delegation is very powerful. Senator Menendez from New Jersey has a strong Cuban-American constituency. They're very powerful. There's even a Cuban constituency in Senator Reid's in Nevada. But other than domestic politics, the other reason is we're obviously dealing with a country that has political prisoners, over 200, that doesn't allow freedom of speech, and that is essentially a dictatorship. So it's hard for us to argue, oh, you should get rid of the embargo, because it becomes very symbolic. And that's why in our report we're saying, okay, keep the embargo, much as President Obama said, but take away the parts of the embargo that aren't working, that prevent us from contact with the Cuban people. Because it has been proven that when you have democracy, it has to come from within. We need to take down the communications embargo as well as the people embargo, because we need to get in to Cuba books, magazines, TV, radio, because the more contact the Cuban people have with what is going on in the world, the greater chance they'll become agents for change in Cuba.
Michael Ratner, President of the Center for Constitutional Rights, your comment on, well, it's a dictatorship, so the embargo, if loosened, should remain.
Well, look, I mean, I obviously appreciate in some way what Ambassador Huddleston is saying. Obviously, I like Arturo's statement a lot better because he's just for end this embargo. Huddleston has moved, I mean, Vicki has moved to some extent on this. But the idea that this embargo was ever about, quote, promoting democracy in Cuba is what underlies, unfortunately, Ambassador Huddleston's statement as well as Obama's statement. And it was never about that. I mean, from day one, this embargo was about destroying the Cuban Revolution and destroying the idea that a country in this hemisphere could stand up to the United States, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. And that's what this is about. Obviously, a 50-year policy hasn't done anything from these guys who claim that it was about democracy in Cuba. It hasn't done anything on that. So we have to ask ourselves, what's it about? And what it really has been about is essentially destroying the Cuban Revolution. And the idea that we're still going forward here on this same sort of premise of bringing democracy, it just makes no sense to me. I think one thing that's important that Ambassador Huddleston has stressed is all of the stuff going on in the Congress right now about, modifying the family stuff and the objections by the Florida senator and the New Jersey senator. What she has pointed out is Obama can actually change this with the stroke of a pen. He doesn't need that. So what are we doing here?
He could end the embargo with a stroke of a pen.
No, he can't end the embargo. As Ambassador Huddleston said, he can go back to because of the Helms-Burton law, he can only go back to what was in place, really at a certain part of the Clinton administration. But he could at least family travel could be opened up. All kinds of travel could be opened up. Unfortunately, because of legislation in Congress to actually end it, you're going to need Congress. But he can, with the stroke of a pen, do what? Do roughly what the legislation is doing. The question is, why hasn't he done it?
And what would it mean, Arturo OFarrill? You've got 1,100 Americans, including, Carlos Santana, Herbie Hancock, Harry Belafonte, Bonnie Raitt, Danny Glover, Eddie Palmieri, Laura Bickford, of course, yourself, signed on to this. What would it mean if Cuban musicians were able to come in now? And would you like to be going down to Cuba now?
Well, I think it's inevitable that the great artists of Cuba have much to teach us about the definition of jazz. Jazz has its roots in Cuba, and so much of what happened in New Orleans at the turn of the century has to do with the musical roots of danzón, and you just look at Gottschalk, and you look at the music of Jelly Roll Morton, who said without the Spanish tinge, there is no jazz. So right off the fact, as a musician, I think it's imperative that we be able to work with Cuban artists on our soil.
I'd like to ask Ambassador Huddleston about U.S. visa policies in Cuba. On a couple of occasions when I've had the opportunity to travel to Cuba and to interview former President Fidel Castro, he always maintained that his government was willing to allow any Cubans who wanted to leave the island to leave, but the problem was that the U.S. interest section was not granting sufficient numbers of visas for those who wanted to leave, and that in essence that the prior administrations were creating the boat people by not giving enough visas for those Cubans who wanted to come to the United States. Is there any accuracy to that, or you had experience there at the U.S. interest section?
Well, there are two things there. What Fidel Castro was talking about in that comment, I think, were people who wanted to immigrate to the United States. And he was complaining because he thought that we had an obligation to take 20,000 Cubans a year. And at that time, we were not doing so. Now we do take 20,000 Cuban immigrants a year. So I think we're pretty much okay on the immigration from Cuba for people who want to stay in the United States as residents and perhaps become citizens eventually. The bigger issue is really that we're not issuing non-resident visas. Visas to come up for a cultural conference, to come up to study in the United States, to come up to visit a family. And that's just pure and simple because we want to limit to some degree the number of Cubans coming up to the United States, particularly if they're Cuban officials. And I think the best thing to do with that is just treat Cuba and the issuance of visas like we do any other country in the world. But if I could go back to
we have 20 seconds.
I was just going to say President Obama can't change all the travel, but he can change many of the other restrictions that are in Helms-Burton because the Secretary of the Treasury has the authority to do so.
I want to thank you all for being with us. Ambassador Vicki Huddleston served as head of the U.S. interest section in Havana, now at the Brookings Institution. Also want to thank Arturo OFarrill for coming in today. Just won a Grammy Award for his music, leader of the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra. And Michael Ratner, president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. That does it for the show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berkshire, photo producer Armando Angelica, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, and Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.